So,
Awesome.
Peter, welcome back to the show. I have been looking forward to this conversation. You and I have been, what are you calling it? Spilling the tea before the
Yeah.
in the pre-show. But you have a. I'm excited to have you on again, particularly for this reason. Um, you are somebody that I perceive as um, existing in the osmotic barrier between the culture and the industry, where the gun culture and the firearms industry are two different things, and somehow you
Mhm.
walk the line between both of those well. And so I've been looking forward to this conversation with you and seeing how you talk about both, because you represent yourself in one but then also have a keen sense of understanding of the other. But before we get any
Interesting.
further, you are a videographer,
Correct.
photographer, and a
Videographer, mostly. Photographer, I do it, but I technically usually consider myself more of an amateur.
okay. So videography being different, and then you've worked professionally in what you said,
The
the wedding industry.
So I've been in the wedding industry for, I think this is my ninth year,
Hmm.
and focusing on, like, it sounds so stuck up when I say this, but this is like the phrase that we use, the luxury destination market. So it's pretty niche, targeting
Fair.
events typically in the $1 to $10 million range.
Hmm.
And almost everything, like 90% of my weddings this year are overseas. So almost everything is international.
And I've been profoundly jealous of your traveling that comes from that, which is great to hear, great
Yeah.
to see. But
I am not at all jealous. I would rather be at home with my wife and daughter.
grass is
So
always greener. Grass is always greener.
I've done both, and I like the staying at home more.
Fair.
Yeah,
But the point on that one is gun culture.
appreciate
We
that.
in gun culture we talk about values. One of those values is about around the home, and we
Okay.
want to see our families thrive, which comes from, well, of course, you have to get married. So I think
Yeah.
is ironic as it sounds, or not ironic, as simple as it sounds, the distinction between the difference and the kind of, what would you call it, the dissonance between weddings and guns, um weddings and the weddings over here and the gun culture over here. I think the dissonance comes from outside our culture and not inside.
Yeah, I think I would agree. But I think I would say that because both are rooted in biblical principles in my mind. Like,
Absolutely.
I enjoy filming weddings because I'm helping capture someone's vows to each other to enter a more perfect union, right? Whether they're believers or not, they are still getting married between the two of them and God, and they're making vows to each other. And I believe all of that is rooted in scriptural principles. And all of my reasons behind guns and wanting to be in the gun industry at all are also rooted in biblical principles. So I think it makes sense that they actually connect more, and people have distorted that.
All right. Well, we're going to have to take a break for the show's sponsor here in a moment, but I want to ask you one question before we do, and that is, are you and this is going to be completely from the wedding side. Are you
Okay.
familiar, or is this just my impression? Are you familiar with, or am I off base on this one, with a sort of perspective and mentality of approaching weddings as trivial and burdensome?
No.
Okay.
Am I familiar with that perspective? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Okay.
I am
For
familiar with that perspective. Clearly, my
okay,
thoughts on it is that is an incorrect thought.
I would think so. I definitely agree that it's incorrect. It's kind of like the same mentality that approaches masculine, let's call it masculine dress,
Okay.
masculine, the masculine approach to
Yeah.
aesthetics, and something that I do appreciate about your work. And so I'm probably, what is the what is it what's the phrase when you load a question? It's not a loaded question in that sense. It's not begging the question. It's, I am preparing all of the components to get the it's
I know
probably
what you're
not.
talking about, but I don't know what. I can't think of the
Yeah,
phrase.
it's a turn of phrase that has to do with, well,
Yeah.
let's let's roll on with the show then. So Now, I'm very excited to announce the first official sponsor of the Redacted Culture Cast. Obsidian Arms is one of those companies that reflects the many facets of gun culture. Not only are their firearms frequently found on competition fields like USPSA and 3Gun, but they are a Minnesota-based, US-sourced original equipment manufacturer. Obsidian Arms makes their own punch and tool kits for the amateur and professional gunsmith out of Little Canada, Minnesota, that come with a lifetime warranty. Whether it is fine parts that require a Swiss machine, or you're in the design phase and are looking for an American machine shop that is in tune with the needs of gun culture, go check out Obsidian Arms at obsidianarms.com. Thank you, and now back to the show. So we've been talking about weddings, and we've been talking about the gun industry, and you have been traveling. Let's start with something close to home and kind of easy. Let's talk about NRA. The NRA was an annual meeting, and how was that this year?
That was, well, I can't say this year compared to other years. This was actually my first industry event of any kind that I've been to. I'm pretty much a noob in the gun industry, so fully admit that. But so it was my first time to go into anything. To me, it was just a really amazing opportunity to get to meet a bunch of online friends in person. You know, there's guys like you that I've had long conversations with and have never talked to. You and I at least have had, conversations on video chat, but there's guys that I've only ever texted. One guy that I was meeting up with, he was like, "Oh, meet me over at the SIG booth." And I walk over to the SIG booth, and I'm looking around, and I was like, "Wait a second, I have no clue what the heck this guy looks like," because he only posts pictures of like guns and stuff like that, and I've never seen him actually post a picture of himself. And so maybe he has, and I just didn't recognize that it was him. So I was like, "Dude, I don't know what you look like. We've been chatting online for like 2 years, and I don't know what you look like." So that element was wonderful. A few brands that I've been in conversations with for some time now that we were able to like sit down more and dig in a little bit deeper. And then I was able to just have some really good conversations with Primary Arms. Holosun was a fascinating conversation considering their controversy and the drama surrounding Holosun and articles recently that have come out about them. So that was really good. And yeah, it was enjoyable to me. I kind of knew who I wanted to talk to and what I wanted to talk to those people and brands about. So I didn't really run into any of the FUD type presentation. I'm sure I saw a lot of people there that I was guessing they carry a compact 1911 and 45 and smaller back or something like that, but do what you want to do.
Yeah, NRA, the NRA annual meeting and SHOT Show have, from my memory, have been the kind of two big events of the year. And NRA is a traveling show. It's in different locations every year, but SHOT Shows at the same spot all the time. So you got these two factors going, and it's not fair. I don't think it's actually fair to really compare the two in the sense of the culture side, because SHOT Show is everybody, and NRA is a pie of the gun culture, a pie slice of the gun culture. So, and it for a while, I think that pie slice favored, not what I would think of as our corner.
Right.
So, but yeah, no, you're always going to run into them. The big distinction from SHOT Show this year, and this is a testimony to the success and the movement of, not the movement like the movement, but the direction that even larger organizations have gone, or the gun culture in general, is that this year at SHOT Show was very, very, very different than SHOT Show 2015. And that was the big difference, and we've been going for a couple of years, but the big difference is it's not all about celebrity anymore. It's not about the different. It's like to even risk getting pseudo political. It's like it's diverse. There's a lot of people there that are not there for the celebrity, so there's some sense of equality. And then what's the I in DEI? Whatever. I don't care. So but my joke on that, instead of it being a joke, like it's actually that there's a lot of a younger crowd, and many of us are there to spend time with our own people, and so it's a lot less of like, oh, where's your badge? What badge do you? Oh, you don't work for like meh. There's a
Yeah.
lot. There used to be a lot of introductions where it's like you meet somebody, they look at your badge, and then they look at you, and they determine whether or not they're even going to talk to you based on the badge. I think a
No
lot of
way.
that. I think a lot of that has gone away. The
Well, that's good to know.
elitism. So
That's good
it'd
to
be
know.
interesting to see when we make it to NRA again how much it's affected that corner of the culture. So
Yeah, like I said, I wouldn't be able to speak to that because one, I don't have a point of reference, and then two, I had a very thought out list of who I wanted to talk to, and I literally would talk to one person at, or not one
mhm.
person, but talk to someone at one brand, walk away, write down, take my phone out, write down some notes about the conversation, whatever it was, and then go on to the next person on my list. And that's how I approached the entire weekend that I was there. So it was very intentional. And I think one of the things that I did appreciate about the NRA that I would probably be different from SHOT Show is that there were a lot less creators. Like I saw a few, but there were a lot less videographers, photographers, etc. And it seemed like a lot of people in certain brands were willing to just like have a good conversation for a solid 30 minutes, which is always my preference. I a couple of times felt very cringy inserting like, hey, I'm a videographer and I like what you guys do and I'd love to work with you. And I kind of hated doing that. I very much would prefer to like, hey, I want to, I legitimately am interested in what your company's about, what your focus is, what are you trying to do in the next couple of years. The tactical games has kind of started to, I don't want to say explode, but it's definitely grown and started to gain more and more ground. And a lot of these companies are starting to like sponsor the tactical games. And it's like, hey, what's
Mhm.
your thought behind that? Why are you trying to do that? And is it just a good financial move? Are you like, do you really believe in what the tactical games are doing? Like, so I enjoy just having some of those good conversations, and I was able
Abs-
to do that quite a bit.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's I still think I'd like to. I know we're using the NRA as like the NRA AM, the annual meeting, whatever.
Hmm.
As the I'm going to describe it as the context, but
Yeah,
it's not really the conversation itself.
for sure.
And so that being the context, where do you or first do you draw a distinction between the gun culture and the firearms industry, and if so, where?
I haven't thought about it before, but I would say yes. When I say there's all of these terms floating around, right? So there's like the
Mm-hmm.
2A community.
Mm-hmm.
And I very much agree with Lucas Buckins, who very strongly a lot of times says it's not really a community. And if this is what you think of as a community, then I think your definition should be changed. Community is like, to me, mostly small and local. But anyway, different conversation. So I would say yes, the gun industry is the professional, well, industry. So if I start a group of guys who like cigars on Facebook and I turn it into, I get 100,000 people in this Facebook group where all we do is chat, and maybe we are organized enough to have weekly calls talking about our favorite cigars. That's not an industry.
Mm-hmm.
An industry is, well, I don't really know how I would define it, but that's the gun companies and manufacturers and people who are making different things and specifically professionally working within that space surrounding the manufacturing and production of weapons, firearms, kit, etc. The community would be people who are joined together in like-mindedness on the issue of gun ownership.
Gotcha.
And then I would say the Second Amendment community, if there is one, would be potentially leveling that up a bit. So within like the gun community, you would include a lot of guys who are like, I have guns to hunt. I don't have a concealed carry permit. I don't have any of these guys.
Mm-hmm.
These guys up here, maybe just this one up on the top, because this is just a bolt gun, but I don't have AR-15s. I don't have a handgun. And if I do, it's like a little revolver for home defense. But these are the guys that are purely like hunters. And then the Second Amendment community is the people who are much more like, okay, no, I need a carry gun. I need an AR-15 M4 carbine rifle of some kind. I need body armor. If I can afford it, I need nods. that's more in my mind of what like the Second Amendment community is. They're more minded to, well, what the Second Amendment is for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I guess you could say there's a Second Amendment industry potentially too, but that would be very small.
In our generation, we've seen the use of the word industry kind of get buttered pretty thin, or spread pretty thin, and not to make a Lord of the Rings quote too early in the show, but
never too early.
Never too early to. It's like was it?
Let's start with it next time.
It's like butter scraped over too much bread.
Exactly.
So, my point being is, industry, the industry, industrial, the production of goods. There's there's a kind of technical term we could go into. The industry has to do with the production and distribution and sale of goods.
Right.
And then you'd say, well, then what about services? And then we go, we're now getting pretty smooth. But it's the firearms industry has to do also with, you have people who work in HR and you have people who work in marketing. If you work in marketing, are you part of the industry or are you?
So I would potentially draw this distinction. And you mentioned, maybe it was when we were talking before, that I kind of walked the line between those two things to an extent. And I think this is why I would say, and there's a lot of people who do that, I would say you could very simply define the gun industry as those who are professionally in the industry. So if you work as HR for a gun company, and it could be the least gun company of all the gun companies out there. I don't know exactly what that would mean, but if you work HR for some gun company, you are professionally employed within the gun industry. You are part of the gun industry versus someone who is purely a consumer of guns. And a consumer of guns would then potentially be falling into the gun community.
Yeah, I think of it. The short distinction would be, I like the professional side. If you are by trade and by labor essentially part of the industry, and then the gun culture is entirely voluntary. You are only in the gun culture by volunteering to participate in the gun culture. There's no assumed entrance. People can be in the firearms industry, but not in the gun culture. But I think the gun culture itself is entirely voluntary. It has to do with meaningful or intentional participation in a small C community, big group of people who are interested in furthering values. And I think one of the things that binds the gun culture together is even as crazy as it sounds, the collective desire to have something to circle the wagons around.
Yeah,
I think it's a bit meta for 2015 speak, whatever, 16 maybe, but it's a bit kind of broad. But I think one of the things that binds the gun culture together is a desire to have a subject that is worth circling the wagons around, and this subject happens to be the furtherance of life and the participation in the community. So
yeah, no, that's good. I agree.
All right. Well, I'm glad you agree, because if you didn't, I'd have to kick you off the show. Just boot right there.
There we go. Good conversation.
I'm a dictator. Let's do it.
All right, that's your show, so 100% dictate away.
No, sarcasm. But yeah, no, the way to.
I will rebel though.
You will rebel. It is in my nature.
I'm part of the 2A community, so if you're a dictator, I'm coming for you.
Yeah.
Shed the blood of tyrants.
The scorpion and the toad. Now we will both drown. It is in my nature.
Yes.
But no. So moving on, the gun culture is you're absolutely correct in that firearms owners does not constitute the gun culture, and I think whatever we're talking about when we refer to the gun culture, I do believe that it's going to continue to go through forms of like maybe small identity crises, particularly around subjects like what is the end goal and what are the limitations that we ought not do but ought place on ourselves. One limitation example is don't go into debt to buy nods. Pretty, it's a
Yeah.
cultural concept, but we make the suggestion.
Yeah. And if I can insert here, I have a couple of thoughts on that. I think this is interesting. So one thing that came to mind is, and I'll refer to him a lot because I like him. And yeah, I'll leave it at that. But like Lucas Buckins kind of coined the phrase. I think it was him who coined the phrase, the citizen defense industry.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
I think that's kind of an interesting way to focus on the industry side, not just community consumers, but those companies that are minded towards equipping civilians. And if you rewind, heck, even 10, 15 years ago, they were far and few between, whereas now there are quite a few that maybe are not solely minded to arm civilians, but there are definitely plenty of companies, I would say quite a few companies, who are being intentional about targeting and manufacturing even equipment geared towards the civilian tactical use, which used to previously not be something that existed.
Do you think people? So the first conversation that you and I had was what about a? It wasn't a year ago, but it was probably
Like something like that. Yeah.
it was approaching something like that, and I think there was a bit of a bend or a direction approaching it from being new to the gun culture or
Mm-hmm.
the new to the firearms industry. I don't think that's appropriate anymore because I've seen your work and I've watched your work with interest for sure. But the point being said is, do we take for granted now the amount of resources that are made available to the citizen? And is there something rooted in that we can claim, place a banner on, a flag, and then move in that direction? And an example of that would be plates, body armor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm assuming 20 years ago, the only way that you found most people found that was very, very, very niche corners or
Yeah.
something kind of like a very maybe edgy at the time military surplus concept, or like it
Yeah.
had to be around the GWAT. But now I can go on to Faro concepts, and I remember there was a time that I bought my own set of plates, and I had to submit some sort of proof that I was a professional,
Yeah.
which it was weird because it wasn't like,
They're not restricted in any sense. It's
y-
technically.
yeah, but it was very, and it was from a rather large company, a rather
Yeah.
well known company. I'm not going to dox them on this one, but it's like, in order for me to order plates, I had to prove sort
Yeah.
of that I was a professional, which was odd because at the time I was working as a private contractor or a military
Mm-hmm.
contractor, right? So like I'm like what is my proof? I just called them and
Right.
said, "Hey, this is who I am. I need to buy a pair of plates." And they're like, "Oh, okay." Like I phone called. That's how I
Yeah.
ordered. And now you can go online and you can just
Yeah.
order them. And so,
I don't. I hesitate to say take it for granted. I
okay,
think, and I'll explain why. I in a second. I think we don't appreciate it, which maybe you could say those are saying the same thing, in the sense of we realize that there's a lot of people now say, oh, there's so many gun restrictions. It's like the worst that it ever has been. And I don't think we recognize that that is not the case at all. Quite a few different things are significantly better than they ever have been. The acquisition of certain things like plates, like nods, is better than it ever has been. And to that whole citizen defense industry, there are specific manufacturing designing of goods targeted at civilians, even like Holosun. This is one of the things that I think is pretty awesome that they're doing, whether you like them or not. No one else is trying to do this nearly as much, is making they have an RDS with night vision. That's night vision, not night vision compatible, has built-in night vision. They're about to launch one.
A thermal? I know they've got a thermal.
No, it's night vision, and they're about to launch one. They're releasing it next month, if I'm correct. That's thermal. So it's like I have one that I could show you. It's like this. It's a brick essentially. It's kind of
Yeah.
large, but it sits on top of your gun. And when you turn it on, what you're looking through your field of view for the RDS
Mhm.
is night vision.
Is it a? Is it a? It's digital. It's a digital.
I
It's a
I would
glass.
imagine so. Yes.
Yeah. Well, it has. I think at this point in time it has to be. But so you've got an RDS, a red for a rifle. I'm assuming it's not the
Yeah.
pistol version, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think I've seen it. I don't.
The
I don't.
thermal one is pretty. I don't believe they've launched the thermal one yet, but I
Okay.
saw it at the NRA show and it's pretty epic. But not going down that rabbit trail unless you want to, but just using that as an example where it's like obviously that's not designed for military. They're purely like, hey, how can we just give civilians a little bit of something that maybe you can't afford to spend however many thousands of dollars on nods. So we're
Mm-hmm.
going to make this to just improve your ability to defend your home a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very tactical. You wouldn't use that for hunting, obviously. So, well, I'm sure that probably wouldn't be legal if it was for hunting. But anyway, so things like that. I don't want to say, so there's a lot of things like that that I think we should appreciate. The reason I hesitate on the term take for granted is because those things should be ours.
Okay.
And when
So
I say take for granted, I kind of feel like, oh, this is a privilege to have. Citizens having access to plates should not be considered a privilege. It should be very much considered a right. And I
Jamie,
think
clip that. That's exactly where we're at. You're 100%.
so America screwed up. Honestly, that golden age of America screwed up a lot of things. Yeah, my mind is running down this long list of during that golden era where things are super wonderful and very family focused and America was safe and industrious. Yeah, there's a lot of crap that was going on that is now
You're
impacting
talking about
us.
the kind of the myth of the 1950s, like
Yeah,
no, I think we should
1950s through like Reagan era
I
and
think
stuff
we
like
should
that
roll.
too.
I think we should just footnote start. You said your mind was a train going down the road. Just run through it, dude. Do it.
Well, that's one of them. For example, anything related to guns is like, okay, well, the amount of restrictions around guns, the amount of industry, people very much reminded that our communities were safe because of law enforcement. And sure, everyone had a bolt action gun or a shotgun in the back of their pickup truck and there weren't any shootings, but we're still talking about shotguns and bolt guns and not no one had AR-15s in the back of their car, right? Like they're like, oh, that's for military. That was very much the predominant mindset during that era. One of the big ones for me is like, public schools started to become significantly more popular during that time. And people were like, oh, this is great. Like, prayer was allowed until, when was prayer taken out of public schools?
Wasn't it in the 80s?
80s, I think so. Yeah. So before that, prayer was allowed in schools. And they're like, oh, this is great. Like people were praying. It was very Christian oriented, but I'm still like public school socialist. I'm not willing to defer on that term whatsoever. Like I believe the institution of the public school is a socialist institution. My tax dollars are paying for a bunch of other families that I've never met in my life for their kids to go to school. Whether they can afford it or not, I don't care. I should not be paying for someone else's kids to go to school. So public school and how prominent that was, and just because it was more politically in line with some of the beliefs that we would hold nowadays, people think that it's okay. Marriage is one of the big ones. Getting tax deductions related to marriage. I think nowadays we have these bills defining whether or not marriage is between a man and a woman. And a lot of Christians, myself included, will go like, well, what in the world does the government have to do with defining what marriage is? Well, the reason that it matters is because the government has to define what they recognize to give different tax deductions and stuff like that to those married people. I don't think there should be any sort of incentives from the government to be entering into a committed relationship with an individual. I think the government needs to stay away from that. But people would look at that and go like, oh, but they're promoting a long-term committed relationship. They're promoting the family unit. And that's partially, unless I'm incorrect on this, that was the intention behind it. They recognize that obviously people who come from like a good family, there's less crime, there's more financial responsibility, all of those sorts of things. That's all true. But I don't believe that it's the government's role to incentivize morality. I think that gets the government's role to punish. I don't even want to say immorality, but various certain forms of evil. But I don't think incentivizing morality is what the government's supposed to do. And that started, I believe, in the 1930s. I wouldn't be quoted, should not be quoted on that.
Well,
now it's biting us and coming back to haunt us and causing all sorts of problems. And yeah,
the century of the 1900s for the world was not a good century.
No,
it was not a good century for the West, particularly, but also. Like that, and that is such a broad painted picture. But I mean, what are you going to say? 2 world wars, right? Those aren't good.
No.
You had the sort of the end and the death of the Enlightenment, which more or less took place around 1910, 1920.
Yeah.
You saw the
invention of the nuclear bomb.
The permanent changing of the face of war by the potentiality of mutually assured destruction.
Which have you seen? Side note: have you watched Oppenheimer?
I have not yet.
I would put it in my top 5 greatest movie. I might say it's the greatest movie ever made. I would be potentially willing to say that. It's not my favorite because it's not. It's entertaining to me, but it's not necessarily like a super entertaining movie, if you understand what I mean by that.
I get it. Okay.
It's slow. It's 99% dialogue. It's very historical. It borderlines on a documentary. But the documentation and just the visual dramatization of how much the world changed when the bomb was invented. And they make you feel that in a way, and that draws attention to that nowadays we don't stop and think about it. And that was the intention, Christopher Nolan's intention behind making the movie, is like, hey, this is something that we should be more aware of and something that we should consider deeply. And most people don't even stop to think about it. So
yeah, I want to be careful about the most people type statements. This is not like this isn't a tut-tut, by the way. It is more like, okay, how do I change the way that I think so that I can recognize generalizations and then keep them properly in their place?
For sure.
So that's about how it is. It's sort of a technicality, but the
general American public does not stop, and I'd be willing to make this generalization.
Yeah.
The general American public does not stop and consider, or first world countries do not stop and consider the severity of the fact that so many different countries have a nuclear arsenal.
Yeah, that does make sense.
And how much that altered mankind forever.
I'll be a little bit more aggressive though, and I'll say the general here's a generalization that will get me some anger. My opinion of the majority of the American population is that they're illiterate.
No, fully agree. 100% agree.
It's just, and I know that sounds like it's a very elitist of me, but what I mean by illiterate is not so much that they can't make shapes into sounds and read words, is that they're not intentionally participating in the understanding of concepts and their correlation to reality. Now that sounds, again, super long-winded.
But you are elitist. You are, sorry, you're not elitist, but you are elite. Mm-hmm. If you were to just purely based off of just like some of the educational standards studies that have been put out there, you and I are both 100% in a top percentage of being skilled in communication, in general education and knowledge of history, in the ability to logic and reason through things. Like 100% you are in a top percentage. So I would say you are elite. the standard is so radically low that truthfully it's not that hard to be anymore. But
Fair enough. Well, we've been seeing studies come out where schools are graduating, high schools are graduating kids from high school who actually can't read, like can't
yeah,
even read the letters on, can't read. And we've seen that presented in books and conversations about it. And so I want to go back to, actually want to change kind of, not necessarily change gears, but I want to go back to this idea of like where things started going wrong in the 1950s. Because the gun culture is, I think, in this sense, a bit of a response. Yeah, sure, there tends to be a bit of black pill negativity
yeah,
that transfers itself around the community, but at the same time, like, how close are we to a convention of states
yeah,
where you're going to have universal constitutional carry again? It's only
mhm,
if we continue moving in the direction that we're doing, and the people who are within gun culture continue to maintain momentum and recognize that, like, as we encourage one another to go forward and do better and to participate in our local communities, that by that meaningful participation we heal the wounds that were made generations past, which which creates a schism between the man and his community. And so we do this, but I mean, it's only a matter of time till states like California and Washington are forced to heal, not HEAL, but HEEL, in the
yeah,
sense of, yes, I understand that your citizens or your government have put in something that you call an assault weapons ban, but not only is it unconstitutional, but it is now illegal to enforce. There are ways that we've seen this happen. The ATF
yeah,
brought about the brace ruling, which I believe was actually an intentional economic attack on the firearms industry. I don't think that it was in, and
100%.
I think the sole purpose of the brace ruling was to affect people's paychecks. I
Yeah,
think the purpose is, and if I want to even get a little bit more tinfoil hatty, what I believe is that somebody said, which administration did this come from? Right? It came from Biden's administration, and that somebody in that administration, wittingly or unwittingly, said conservatives buy AR-15s. The brace is the most popular component that goes into most what many conservatives are buying. If we make that illegal, it will affect their paycheck, and we have a way to do that. And
yeah,
even if the method that we go about doing it is unconstitutional and illegal, or even more crazy and immoral, it will take them a year to recover, and during that time demoralization will take place, economic instability will take place, and
yeah,
we will be able to unseat people from their participation in the gun culture, or the community, sorry, not the gun culture, the firearms industry. I
yeah.
think that's what the purpose was.
I mean,
So,
that's very similar to the purpose of the entire NFA. Was so many of those items, right? Like, suppressors and pistol braces were not made illegal. They just simply, you have to pay at that time an extreme amount of money to be able to own one, which ironically basically made the people who could afford to then purchase suppressors were the ones who were already wanting to use them illegally, like, mobsters and whatnot. So it was very, very, very ineffective at accomplishing what they said they were trying to do, and very effective at accomplishing what they were actually trying to do. But it wasn't making those things illegal, it was simply controlling people through money, essentially.
mhm. I think that can be overturned. I do believe that it is
Yeah.
possible that we could see the NFA overturned in our lifetime. I
I
I refuse to be black pilled about that.
No, and I hate some of the comments that have come through on recent videos that I've posted of like saying actually that the video that you mentioned earlier, sorry, before we actually started when we were chatting before, that I did with TA Targets talking about God, family, country, and how you can impact culture yourself. And so many of the comments were saying like, oh, it's too late. Like, why bother? And that like resignation to the word is leaving me. your fate,
fatalism. Yeah.
fatalism. There we go. That fatalism, like, I absolutely cannot stand that. I'm like, I don't care how far gone we are. Like, either I'm going to surrender or I'm going to fight. Like, and I'm
Here's
never going to surrender, so I'll just keep fighting. I don't care how far gone we are. I'll at least keep fighting.
So here, you want to know another generation that was profoundly fatalistic?
Hmm.
The generation that lived in America right before the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Early 1700s Americans were very fatalistic.
So are we setting up for another revolution?
Ooh, I'm talking about the era of like Jonathan Edwards, the first Great Awakening across the.
I don't believe Jonathan Edwards was, though.
He was not particularly a
I
fatal.
am of the
Well,
I am of the opinion that he would have endorsed the revolution. But that is there's a lot there's talk about a tiny niche topic that almost no one has ever even thought of. There's actually a lot of opinions on whether or not the revolution would have been impacted by Jonathan Edwards, or at least how it would have been impacted by Jonathan Edwards.
yeah, because he had an untimely early death.
Yeah.
But
He
Jonathan
was
Edwards.
so influential over a large portion of America.
I gotta bring this up. I don't have. It's Jonathan Edwards, famous for "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God." This is where a lot of people culturally appropriate the idea of fatalism, not fatalism. Fire and brimstone. Apologies.
Yeah.
So, but even then, outside of that, outside of reading it, do you understand what fire and brimstone is talking about? You know, what this idea of sinners in the hands of an angry God is like. It's not actually a speech in a book of condemnation, but compassion.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I would have been interested. I would be interested to see what the impact of Jonathan Edwards might have had on the American Revolution, but unfortunately, we'll never know because it's not possible. However, I think some of the fatalism of that time was also a little bit more in the lines of theological determinism.
Yeah.
Where at the time there was a question on whether or not the sovereignty of God, in this sense, I know we're getting a little bit theologically niche again, but the sovereignty of God had absolute authority over time, whereas, in other words, does God actually determine all activities that take place? And if so, how does that morally add up, or how does that affect our systems of morality?
Yeah.
And
The
so
sovereignty of God and free will of man contrasted is definitely, I think it might be safe to say, I won't say definitely. I would say it's probably safe to say the most misunderstood broad theological concept.
yeah, it's two concepts in tension. Are you going to have libertarian free will on one? It's two concepts in tension. Are you going to have libertarian free will on one end, where, this is not libertarianism like American libertarianism, but libertarian
Correct.
free will. Not that we ought be free, but that mankind's decision-making matrix is completely independent from the will of God, versus the opposite being God having authority over all things. Which
Which would then lead to people saying, like, I decided to drink a cup of coffee during this. That was, the will of God that I should be drinking a cup of coffee right now. I'm wearing a black shirt, and God sovereignly willed that I be wearing a black shirt for this podcast, things like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, again, not to get theological or anything, but yeah, actually, never mind. I won't say it.
No, we're not going to be able to uncover it completely in this episode, but we are going to be able to go into it. Let's flesh this out again on the concept of public schooling. Now, I was homeschooled. Plenty of my friends were homeschooled. And while that seems while as I went out into the world writ large, let's say the military as an example, I certainly was the minority in that sense. The majority of the people that I lived and interacted and worked with came from public schooled, broken families. Let's be very clear. At one point in time, I remember having a conversation with my parents saying, as so far as I know, in my, not in my unit as in the battalion, but in my immediate circle, bigger than my squad, but my platoon level, which is about 30. So far as I know, I'm the only one whose parents are still together, which is
Crazy.
very likely wrong. I'm not
Yeah.
saying this with absolute authority, but the majority of the people that I knew
The
in
point
that,
you're making stands, though.
mm-hmm,
You were a minority in that your parents were still together.
mm-hmm, yeah, and that I had a good relationship with them.
Yeah. That's an even smaller number.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and on the to me, maybe you could nuance this more. Um, to have a thought on that as well. I'm all fine with nuancing things, but I was talking to my wife about this because I had a lot of conversations with we're visiting in-laws recently, and her dad likes to pretty much nuance everything, and I am very not nuanced a lot of times. And then I stopped and said, Proverbs say the glory of a young man is in his strength, and the glory of an old man is in his gray hair. And I wonder if there's an element of that, or it's something to that extent. And I wonder if there's an element of that it's like it is for me, a young man, to be much more hardlined and less nuanced in my youth, so that as I get older, I can become more mellow. But that if I were to start off that way, then perhaps I would become compromised as I mellowed out. But anyway, different thought. I just had that thought.
No,
Curious, actually, what's your,
you're getting into almost wild at heart John Eldridge territory, where
yeah,
you've got the period of time where a man is supposed to be a king, or a warrior, or later a lover, or
yeah,
or you could also do archetypes. More and more, I've been identifying with the archetype of the wizard in the tower kind of thing, where it's like,
yeah,
what is this, what's the gig about the wizard? He lives in a tower in
hmm,
the woods where no one can bother him, and he stays in his tower, and he's just trying to do his thing, like read his books or do his wizardry, his little, but
yeah,
he's not doing magic to like impress the people. In fact, when they come to him for boons, it's usually like begrudging, like, okay, I'll fix your broken bone, now get out of here, kind of
right,
thing. And it's
right,
like, I get it, in the sense of he doesn't want to be burdened by the common rabble, which is
hmm,
such a, I know we're going back to the level of elitist, but um I think I don't want to be so, I don't want to even tear it down, because we're getting, again, pretty meta about this. But the warning would be, especially with young men, to be so caught up in the nuance that they fail to act. And we have another phrase that
yeah,
we use this called, what is it? What's the thing that people call it? Analysis paralysis,
yeah.
right? So there's that, and then the problem with old men. The problem that I have with the old men living in nuance is that, are they actually leading and guiding, or are they just avoiding and dodging the problem,
I
right?
personally am very, my conclusion with all of that is I kind of came to the conclusion that I'm very comfortable being in a position of hardlining on a lot of issues
Mm-hmm.
and then keeping myself open to older, wiser mentors who will put me in check if necessary.
Yeah.
Now, and I don't think this is, I can confidently say, um, if there's one principle that I have lived out consistently, not one, but a huge principle that I have lived out consistently, and during short periods of time when I did not hold to well, my life was in absolute chaos. And that is the principle. Actually, I was reading it this morning, in Proverbs 24. In the multitude of counselors, there is safety.
Mm.
And in periods of time where I was cutting myself off from counselors, my life was just an absolute nightmare. And then other periods of time where even if I was not living the best life, that I not making good, wise decisions, but I was still seeking out and still wanting to expose myself to people who's had good, wise counsel that they could give me. It just kept me from trouble a little bit. And I think being in that position, so I say that to say, like, I'm not gloating in this or
No.
putting myself forward as a standard, but this is something that I think that I have done a pretty good job of. And that is, if I am hardlining on certain issues, I am doing so while very much kind of looking over my shoulder. You know, I'm going there and I'm going into the match extremely aggressively and offensively, but glancing up at my coach every now and then to be like, "Hey, is this? I should keep going? Okay, no, no, okay, let me taper back. Yes, yes, okay, let me go even harder," kind of deal.
Mhm.
So like I'm not doing so blindly and unwilling to
How have you
consider others.
how have you found mentors? It's not easy to do, and I'm fortunate enough
No,
to, well, for example, like one of my mentors I acquired, I enlisted through college, but
yeah,
another one, and he has stood, he has withstood the test of time in that sense. And it's a little bit, there's a little bit of maybe not irony, but uh, cosmic humor in saying the student chooses the mentor. But go ahead.
yeah. Um, a couple of thoughts. One, and this, I think this is a really, really important thing for young men, myself included. It is, I believe, biblically, older men's responsibility to mentor and disciple younger men. And I try to always say this: if you are not a believer, if you don't believe in the Bible, or if you're not just like a practicing Christian or whatever, that doesn't matter. I think most people can stop and recognize the benefit of having someone older and more experienced than them giving them guidance. If you want to go and get good at anything, literally anything, finding someone who is older and more experienced to help you along that path is probably mandatory. So I think that's the older person's responsibility. But I do think there's a responsibility on young men to seek it out to an extent.
Sure.
Because if you are not seeking it out and you're just sitting there going, and I've had friends like this, it's like, yeah, it's not my responsibility. Like, in a church setting, older men are commanded to disciple younger men. And I'm a younger guy. And so if no one's discipling me, it's their fault. So, like, well, perhaps because of your attitude, you are so closed off to it that you haven't even seen opportunities as they have come along. So I think my perspective on virtually everything is perhaps everything is hold to what you have control over and fulfill your responsibility and do not worry as much about what is outside of your control because you can't, if it's outside of your control, you can't do anything about it anyway. So as a young man, I think one of the best ways to acquire mentors is one, to simply be actively, openly looking for them, not necessarily pursuing, but being just like, hey, is there someone who could be in that position? And then oftentimes asking directly, just being assertive and going up and asking. And I think when you have that position, that mindset, you oftentimes don't even have to ask. Those mentors will find you out. Those mentors will come alongside of you. If you're a young man and every spare second that you're not working or studying or dating a girl, whatever you're doing productively with your time, every second that you have, you're just trying to hang out with your friends, go to a bar, go do whatever. You're not exactly even positioning yourself to be able to find a mentor. And I think positioning yourself in circles that it could be available is extremely helpful. And I do think there's an element of responsibility to, are you choosing friends and friend groups that are purely made up of peers, or are you choosing friends and friend groups that are made up of your superiors?
This is,
And
yeah, go ahead.
and it,
Sorry.
and it may and my last thing was, it may not even be necessarily someone who could be a mentor. But I found this with music, if you expose yourself to people who are better than you, your superiors, even if they are a peer, but superior, they very potentially have a mentor who you may then come in contact with. And if they see you having an eagerness and teachability and humility to wanting that mentorship, mentors will latch onto that.
Yeah. What I was going to say, and I apologize for interrupting you, is
Oh, okay.
one thing that I observed in throughout my life was that one key difference between public schooled and homeschooled kids is that public schooled kids only had friends in their peer. They could only socialize
Yeah,
with their peers.
100%.
They not univer. By the way, yeah, not universally. Sure, you're the exception to every rule. I get it. But my point being said is that um, public school, the idea of children being public school or children who grew up in the public school, and again, we all kind of grew out of our own awkwardness for sure. But well, most of us did. But
But on a purely like educational basis, the entire public school system is based off of segregation by one factor and one factor alone, age. And to break out of that is extremely difficult to do.
very difficult to do.
It's like it doesn't matter how advanced you are, how smart you are, whatever. It's like no, you stay in your grade. That's purely based on age.
Exactly. Yeah. Your age. Well, yeah. It's not. There's no. There's this imagination of scaling for intelligence, but it's not really that way. Or
Yeah,
division of labor and development for different purposes. I don't. I want to be careful too because I know there's this constant criticism that's thrown at the public school system, which is it was created by the Rockefellers to produce perfect factory workers, and
mhm.
okay, like that's an assessment. Where's the morality attached to this?
Yeah,
Because there's nothing immoral about working in a factory.
yeah,
It's not, you may not be making white collar job money, maybe, the trades are coming back pretty hard, but okay. My point is like that is not a sufficient enough statement to condemn the concept of a public education. The issue I think that needs to be more nuanced and understood by families is, quite frankly, parents don't. We would rather blame a public school system, the idea of a public school. We would rather blame that than accept the responsibility that we have to our children, and that is the mentality that many people have taken on.
and this is my yeah, and I couldn't care less who started it or why,
Mm-hmm.
um, and whether or not that was moral or amoral. My objection and that whole conversation about as a young man hardlining
Mm-hmm.
was to set this up of like I have a very very hard line of being anti-public school, radically
Okay.
anti-public school, and my hard line is based off of a couple of principles, one of which you just said. Number one, I at this moment, my wife and I are paying for the education of other kids in topics that we do not believe in.
Yes, you are
That
paying
is,
money to
I
for
am
other
paying
kids.
money for other kids to study things that I do not think they should be learning.
Wait a minute. No, 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 no. You have to change the language you're talking about because this is a philosophical problem. You use the word learning. They're being
Being
educate
taught.
they're being taught or educated in a subject that they're learning. And this will call back to people who are familiar with epistemology will say, it's the third criteria of belief. And that is, what does it mean or what does it mean to believe or know something? And the issue here is, okay, let's kind of break down this term. I know we're getting this is again the kind of this is where I think the appropriateness of nuance stands, but we're going to go on to we're going to dig into it. What do you mean by learning? What do you mean by indoctrination? Like everything is indoctrination, dude. Indoctrination.
For sure.
You can't you can't just condemn something as indoctrination. Like I went through Ranger indoctrination program. Right? It was
Okay.
a teaching. It was an evaluative and an introductory education element of Ranger Battalion to see if you could hack it. Supposed to be, at least. I'm not saying that I went through a hard class. I didn't. But the point is, uh, we just we go back to this thing.
For
If
sure.
the if
So
Yeah,
so
you
I
can't
would
just
say it.
condemn it for education. What do you mean by learning?
So I do not believe certain things should be, whether they are learning it or not, whether they're being indoctrinated or not. I do not believe certain information should be given and be part of a course curriculum. I am in disagreement with the structure of the course curriculum to students, specifically of students in certain age groups.
And here's that nuance, right? Are you saying that information should be withheld from them? Or,
Yeah. Heck yeah.
Okay. There you
100%. 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 16-year-olds, 100% should not have access to all of the information out there in the world.
Because the goal is
that is 100. Yeah, absolutely 1000%.
Because I want to make a distinction here between two different things. One of them is, should certain information be withheld from people, or are you saying that what is being taught is not just what is being taught is also not true?
So I will give you two examples. I am perfectly fine with information being communicated.
Okay.
Either as true or not true. Sometimes that matters, sometimes that doesn't. And I'll give you an example of that. So I believe in creation.
Sure.
Earth is roughly at 10,000 years old. I don't particularly care how particular you get on that number, but the Earth is young. It's not millions and billions of years old.
Young Earth creation.
And God made it in 6 literal days, 24-hour days, and on the 7th day he rested. So I believe that. And people can criticize me all they want, couldn't care less. That's what I believe. I was taught that and evolution. And I've had extensive conversations with evolutionists that I understood evolution more than they did, because I was taught both. 100%. And I was told this one is correct for XYZ. So I was technically taught, in my perspective, a bunch of lies about evolution. But they told me why, and I was given both and taught why these were true and these were not, so that I could then draw my own conclusions on that. Essentially, I was guided in a certain direction, but I was given the information. And whether you believe evolution is true or not, I've always been like, well, hey, if you think that creation is true, then what harm does teaching it cause? If you're accurately representing the facts, then the facts should speak for themselves. So that is an example where I am perfectly fine with something that I don't believe in being taught, because I think they should be taught so that people understand all of the worldviews. You could say if you're doing a religion class and someone's studying religious history, it would then be beneficial to study Hinduism, Buddhism, Mormonism, Christianity, Catholicism, all of those different things.
Yep, Islam,
Islam,
even panentheism and New Age cults. Yeah,
for
absolutely.
Sure, 100%. So that's the difference there of like, okay, now you're talking about information that's being taught to understand all of the information that there is out there. But then there's the conversation, but then there's a different categorization of, and I'm not even talking about indoctrination, though this happens, where in a lot of cases, kids are being given selected information. They're not being given any of the other information. So that's a danger, right? And this is the case, for example, with evolution, where they're being hand-picked, given only the worldview, moralistic worldview that government or those teachers hold to. And so they're being incorrectly guided down a certain direction because they're not being given the whole picture. And further down that line, you get into the like sexual classes, where kids are being taught sexual things that they are way too young for. And when it comes down to, do I think information should be withheld from individuals? Yes, absolutely. I do not want, I don't have any kids this age, but when my kids are 10 years old, I do not want my kids to be taught by someone else about sex. I don't think that that's that other person's responsibility. I don't think, I 100% believe that if I'm paying a private school teacher, let's say that, I'm perfectly fine with private schools are great. If I'm paying a private school teacher, now this is on me if I pick a private school that does this, but if they do this behind my back and they teach information to my kid that I do not think they should be doing that, and they did that without my consent and without my knowledge, that is a problem, which means I believe that they should be withholding that information because it is not theirs to give to their kids. And that is where, like, yes, it sounds very sketchy, if you will, to say we shouldn't, I want you to withhold information from certain individuals, but I 100% do not believe that we should be exposing, especially younger age kids, to some of the information that is out there.
Yeah. Well, it's like it's.
And this is a legal point, right? You're not legally allowed as a 12-year-old to walk into an R-rated movie. Why?
Okay.
They're protecting them from that thing. So this is technically legally understood, and yet that information is oftentimes taught to children at that same age.
Yeah. Well, I mean, how many teachers and part of the education system are not only our generation, millennials and Gen Xers, whose coming of age story always included hiding a nudie mag from your parents.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I mean, let's even go back to like our childhood. I know you're a little bit younger than me, but not horribly so.
How old are you?
I'm 34 right now.
Okay. I'm 32, so yeah.
Yeah, right. And so, like, what was a big movie that came out when we were in our teenage years? Even was Transformers.
Yeah.
Michael Bay Transformers. It's not like Michael Bay's Transformers movies is kind of like, what is it? I'm trying to find a way to describe it. Like, it's not exactly a good movie in the sense of it's not like Oppenheimer, or it's not like Inception, or even Blade Runner 2049, but it's a movie that probably won't go away. It's like, iced tea or Coca-Cola. It's just there. But look, I remember a scene, and I'm pretty sure it's from the first one, where, of course, there's a joke that's being played where the mom of our protagonist is like making a euphemism of his his alone time or whatever, right? It's this whole like, and that was laughed about as if it's, oh, he's just a young man doing his thing, and like it's almost like, if you have you ever seen any of the criticisms of like the TV shows that surrounded the timeline of Married with Children? Are you familiar?
I don't think so. No.
Okay, it was like a 1980s sitcom where the criticism comes out as TV shows. As TV was becoming normalized in American society, the kinds of TV shows that were that were like the sitcom, the Friends of that era, the whatever you want to call it, Big Bang Theory kind of type movies, the shows where like you watched it every day, was around a family where the mother was like, what's the word, that there's a way that I got to say it. I can't remember. The mother was like nagging and cantankerous all the time, and she was always tearing the husband down, and the husband was like miserable, but he was always going to work every day to pay the bills, and his daughter was a slut, and his son was a punk with no meaningful direction. It's just this constant like this era of television in that, and I want to go back to like 1950s, and this idea that, oh well, everything was great back then, is wrong. But there's a phrase that I want to go back to on the subject of education, and it is that education cannot be agnostic. And what I mean by that is that we have this weird idea.
There is no such thing as an agnostic worldview.
Explain.
We're getting down so many rabbit trails here.
No, we're not. This is
an
important.
Agnostic. Neutral is not neutral. The best way that I can explain, like, okay, there's a joke that I heard a long time ago, but I've legitimately, this isn't fleshing it out, but I think this kind of sets it up well. So this person over in this field was the devil's field. The devil had all of his people in it, his demons, whatever. Devil's field. God's field, it's over here. And this person was sitting, there's a fence between them. This person is sitting on the fence. And he's like, oh, shoot, I don't know, like, which side do I want to be on? Do I want to serve God? Do I want to serve the devil? I'm not sure. I'm just going to stay here for a little bit. And then God comes over to chat with him. He's like, hey, what are you doing? And he's like, I'm like, I can't decide whose side I'm on. And God's like, well, you kind of have to, because I own the fence. So you're sitting on my fence right now. And if you don't want to come fight for me, then you better get off of it, or I'm going to kick you off. And like the illustration there is actually no line between them. It's like you can't choose to be neutral. And I do not believe, and this is coming from someone who went through a period of time who claimed to be agnostic, and I can now look at that and go, no, I wasn't. And my wife can say the exact same thing. And I know that's a very, very tiny little, anecdote, and I kind of hate anecdotal argumentation, but an agnostic worldview is antagonist to other worldviews.
Yes.
And people like to think that they are not. They like to think, no, I'm neutral. I simply don't believe in that, or I don't believe in this. But they do. They believe in the supremacy of self. Yes. And that is a very, very, very strong and radical and aggressively antagonistic belief system. So that is not neutral in any sense. So maybe that's the correct way to say it. Agnosticism is not neutral, and people like to present it as being neutral.
Yeah, I think here there's I want to go back to your metaphor of the man sitting on the fence, right? And I think there's another way to think about it, and another way of illustrating it. Okay, so we're gonna build this kind of this metaphor. There's the one. There's two fields: the field of the damned, and then there's the field of the saved, and then there's a man who's sitting on the fence between the two. Does the owner of the field of the damned look at the agnostic? Let's take it from the mind of like a Screw Tape Letters type devil. Mm-hmm. Does the devil have a problem with a man being agnostic? No, because by being 100%. Halfway, you're technically fully in my camp. Yeah. But to God, to the good, the agnostic is somebody who's not willing to commit to the good.
So I would honestly, and maybe I remember it incorrectly, or maybe the joke was aired, but I would say is more accurate to say the devil owns the fence.
Exactly. The devil owns the fence.
Because a person thinking that they are sitting in that neutral ground, they are in fact not serving God. And Jesus said this outright. If you are not serving me, then you are serving
you cannot serve two masters. You cannot serve two masters. So let's go back to this concept of education, right? We have this myth of a theologically neutral concept of education, right? And I think the myth, that's a lie. So the if your education system is
people think they are not religious, which is not possible.
And I've spoken about it before. There's a couple of good speakers who have really brought this up before, and this is not exactly a new idea either.
No.
If you study philosophy and theology, you'll recognize that this is not a new idea. But I think Charles Taylor comes up often on this show with the secular age, but still, there was a professor that I studied under in school who wrote a book on it, he didn't write a book on it, but there was an entire course that was on philosophy and theology that was centered on this subject, that like you cannot be neutral on truth. And it even gets deeper, and we have witnessed this in one of the three fundamental laws of logic, the law of the excluded middle. A thing is either true or it is not true. There is no third option.
Yeah.
And of course, postmodernism or postmodernists in their masturbatory attempts at self-inflation have built within their own identity the Tower of Babel, thinking that if I can't understand it, it is unintelligible.
Yeah.
And by that hubris, the atom bomb, the corruption in education, the destruction of millions of lives has gone on, and yet the hubris of man continues to march forward thinking,
So I'm
Yeah.
going to use this to tie back into what I was originally saying about I don't believe, I'm paying, because I do want to come back to the public school thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to tie this back in when I say right now I am actively paying for other people's kids to be taught things that I don't think they should be taught. This is part of it where they are being, in a lot of cases, being taught things like, oh, it could be as nuanced as they're not being given factual information necessarily that I don't want them like to be taught, like, oh, I don't want them to learn about this sexual practice. That's a very black and white thing that I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, 100%. And I think most people, actually, I can assert pretty strongly, most people do have qualms about what their younger kids are being taught sexually in school. And I know this because that's the reason that one of the primary reasons that Virginia voted red in the past election was because parents discovered what their kids were being exposed to in schools, and they're like, no, we're not okay with that during COVID, because their kids were now, watching classes and stuff like that online at home, and the parents would see it and they had a problem with it, and they're like, no, stop, we're not doing that anymore. So most people, I think most moral parents, or most parents with any sort of moral direction and how they're raising their kids, would say, yeah, we've got limits of what our kids are exposed to at certain ages. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm fine if you have different moral limits on that than me. I couldn't care less. All I'm saying is I shouldn't have to pay for limits that I'm not comfortable with on that front. But then, much more nuanced here is, if you're being taught that there is a neutral center, that truth is not absolute, these are much more fine principles that are being either taught directly or indirectly through the school system. And these are all principles that I am not comfortable with. And again, if you want to learn those things and teach those things to your kids, fine. I am actively choosing not to teach those things to my kids, and it is immoral for me to, and a huge atrocity for me to have to contribute money for your kids to learn those things that I don't want my kids to be learning.
Yeah, I think the money game is going to really. If you look at the corruption of the American system, it's you're going to always see a tie to money, especially with
For
public
sure.
funding, right?
So that's the first, and I'm sorry I'm interrupting you because I really want to get this in. That's the first reason that I would say I should not be active. It's immoral for me to be actively paying for the education of your kids in principles, systems, and hard truths that I do not believe they should be taught, or that I would not choose to teach my own kids.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I think it is an immoral neglect, and I'm being very particular with using that term. I think it is an immoral neglect of the responsibility of parents to be seeing to their kids' education. And that could be seeing through paying for your kids, paying for someone else to be teaching your kids, but
Yeah.
sending them to a school where you're not contributing in any factor, literally to the point that you are not even dropping them off, but they are being picked up at your front door. That is you not having anything to do with your parents' schooling. And
Your
that
children's
to
schooling,
me,
yeah.
with your children's schooling, and that to me is an immoral neglect of the responsibility of parents to see to their children's education.
Yeah, I wonder if there's. I hope to see there be a pretty strong pendulum swing in the generations because of how that 1950s era of abdication of the children to the state is
Yeah.
so ironic because
Yeah.
on the one hand you have and this goes back to that kind of Reagan-esque era. You have on the one hand you have this anti-communist, like this like the this is where we get first, second, third world countries. Second
Yeah.
world countries were like there were third world countries were communist countries, if I'm not mistaken, and first world countries were democratic countries, and then second world countries were just kind of in the middle, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where these things come from. But also, the whole illustration of this point, it is the same people who supposedly grew up in this anti-communist era, created, funded, and paid for the communist system of education where they abdicated their responsibility to their own families and they put it, they foisted it upon the state.
We oftentimes get into, and I say it very mankind in a lot of different capacities, get into a lot of trouble when we are okay with a system that we shouldn't be okay with purely because they agree with us. So in this example, we were like, hey, you know what? Maybe we don't love the whole idea of a public school system, but they're teaching our kids things that we agree with, so sure. And they didn't stop and go like, oh, like now we're going like, oh, they're presenting things that we don't agree with, and so now we have more of a problem with it. But there's a period of time there where it's like, oh, they're in favor of us, so it's okay. So like the government incentivizing marriage. It's like, oh, well, they're in favor of the marriage system that we agree with, so it's okay if they incentivize it. It's like, well, no,
Yeah.
you shouldn't be. Whether it benefits you or not, whether it's in agreement with you or not, you shouldn't be okay with that.
You want to know how enslaved the American population is?
Sure, of course.
That their idea when they discover that their children are learning something, or not learning, their children are being taught something that they do not believe that their child should be taught in the sense. And I know this sounds like odd. It's just the language of it is uncomfortable. But this is how enslaved the American population is. Is that a parent discovers that his child is being given pornography, and instead of immediately pulling that child from the school, he complains about it. And he says, my children shouldn't be taught this.
Yep.
That's how enslaved that person is. Not a free man. That person is a paid for vote. Is what you are. You're not free.
Yep.
You're not.
And you can see this very distinctly by how many people did pull their kids.
Exactly.
A ton of people chose to pull their kids.
Right.
And those people are now the ones who are like, you can see that was a distinct marker of like, oh, these are not the paid votes.
The man who is complaining that his child is being given pornography still believes that he has still abdicated his responsibility to his child. He has still abdicated his responsibility of his child. He has abdicated that responsibility to the state. You're not a free man. You're not a free man, dude. You know what I mean? Like you just aren't. You're a slave. Own it. And
it would be contradicting the fact that they're a slave.
Say what?
Owning it would be a non-slave.
Sure. All right, Nietzsche. All right, we'll let that ship sail. So I think we're gonna have to close here. We're gonna have to wrap up, and I want to spend the last 10 minutes for you. I want to give you kind of an opening window on one thing, and that is you've brought up a lot of interesting stuff. We've talked about education. We've been talking about freedom and values, and we started on the NRA and NRA. And I know that this is exactly the way that these conversations are supposed to go. But I'm glad that we got here the way that we did, and that is, if you were to pull back and look at yourself and the way that, or not only just yourself, but the way that you've looked at the way that the industry interacts with people, the gun culture focuses on, you have all these different kind of disparate, not even disparate, but different bodies of people. And if you were to look at how the gun culture and the gun industry interact in each other in regards to things like education and rights and values and what is right and true and good, what is something that you would like to see, and what is something that you would have, if you could be a mentor to your younger self, what advice would you have given?
That is a very, very broad question, not in a bad way.
I'll use an example for myself. This is advice that I would have given to my younger self. Is at one point in time, I was private contracting, making a fairly decent amount of money, and I wanted to get into competition shooting. And so I, on a deployment, made a bunch of money, and I'm not saying I'm wealthy or rich or anything like that, but I basically created I had time and money, but no experience in competition shooting. And I created a checklist of things that I had to have before I started shooting competition. And I bought those things. And now, how many of those things do I still have? Very few. But I
Mhm.
tried to, I had the opportunity, the time and money to buy all this stuff. What I should have done is played the long game. I should have played the long game. Instead of I had given all things being different. I'm not the only person who's done this, and that is, if I wanted to really build an AR-15 to be useful in competition shooting, I should have played the long game and piece by piece built it out over time with experience instead of coming in, putting it all together, and then buying all this stuff and then competing. And that same mentality can be applied to plate carrier, rucksack, your what is it? Yeah, I don't think people do as much the whole bug out bag mentality anymore. But when
Yeah.
it comes to the stuff that you have on your wall, and I have my own room and I have my own wall for of the same thing. If I were to go back in time, it's play the long game. Don't rush in and buy
Mm.
all of the things and try to do it all at one time.
Yeah.
Small incremental improvements over time vastly outweigh short-term bursts of energy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would, I will answer your question individually, but I also would love to add to that. Like, I think it's not cliche is not the right term. This is talked about a lot. And this is something that I talk about and try to recommend any chance that I get. I have friends, many friends, for example, that have, I'll pull one. I won't name who it is or anything else like that, but just to use as an example, multiple AR-15s in various, maybe a couple of different calibers, a couple of different barrel lengths, and then one pistol that isn't a great carry option and isn't a great home defense option. And I would say prioritization of your weapons is extremely important. And what I always encourage people in on that front is, buy a handgun that you can carry and get good with it. I won't set a standard of what good is, but if you're shooting, 50 rounds at a concealed carry class, that's not the standard. You need to be competent, which means you need to buy ammo. And as fun as buying an AR-15 is, do not buy one until you have gotten skilled with that primary weapon. For the civilian, for the average civilian, a handgun isn't your secondary, it's your
Mm-hmm.
primary. And I think that's misunderstood to an extent, but I think that's very important. I think you need to be wise with that. And, we mentioned earlier, don't go into debt buying nods. I think going into debt over anything is a bad idea, but I think going into debt because you want to be responsible with a firearm is potentially a really, really stupid thing to do. Now, maybe there are, small examples of, the election's coming up, there may be small rioting going on in your city and you realize like, hey, I have my car to pay off or whatever, but I really do need to buy a gun. And it's like, okay, sure, be wise with it, buy a gun. Perhaps you're furthering your debt by doing so, but if there's an urgency there, I can completely understand why
Yeah.
that would take precedence. So, but yeah, that's a phenomenal, your piece of wisdom to your younger self is a phenomenal thing. I think people need to be more aware of that.
Well, it's it's not original.
No, not at
Like I'm
all.
saying,
But it
like
can't be stated enough.
but you've seen it stated before,
Mhm.
and I appreciate that though. And that's why I wanted to have you give your word of advice. So if I'm going to summarize what you're saying is that, like, shore up your certain things first and become proficient in one area, and then expand. It's
Yeah.
like if I think, and this is silly, but here's the I think if I were to apply it in my own head, it was, I remember at one point in time I was buying my first concealed carry handgun. And I looked out into the world and I said, I don't want to get a Glock because everyone's getting a Glock. You know what I have? I have a Glock 19. Do I carry it? Is that my EDC gun? No. I've got another one that I use, but I have that Glock. You know how much a Glock costs? $500, maybe 600, depending on, get a Glock 19 MOS or a Glock 45 MOS. You're paying like 650 with tax, 700 maybe, right?
Yeah.
You could be as high as $700. If I were to go back in time and think about it, and this is that American consumer, if you're chinsing on your EDC gun, your staple center point, bad
Yeah.
news bears, right?
Yeah.
I remember 2020 riots, Minneapolis, world's on fire, everything's going to hell, and people are calling, we had to make a wise choice at the time. As like I had one friend who's saying, you know what, all I have are bolt actions and lever actions. I need to get it's probably a good time for me to get an AR-15. So of course I recommended him time, place, brand, whatever. And he went to the place, bought the thing, and he's very happy with it to this day. Another
What's the
guy,
brand?
he bought a JP Enterprises with
Oh,
an LPVO on it, right?
nice.
Rural, lives in a rural area. He's
Yeah.
not exactly worried of rioters coming to his house, but there were some other things. But it was just the right time for him. And another guy was like, I need to get a body armor plate carrier and everything right now. It's like, no, dude, it's too late for you. You live in downtown Minneapolis. You live in uptown Minneapolis, and and you have. But there were other factors, and it was just like, no, you can't buy all the things in one go and be done with it.
Yeah.
But it was so play the long game, and
Yeah.
sure, there was extenuating circumstances to both, but fine. So,
Yeah.
all right, well, hey.
Well, I didn't give you my answer, and I do want to. I just tagged onto yours, so let me give you a quick answer.
Okay.
And this isn't something that I would say to myself, because I do actually think I was one of the few things that I did well in my early 20s. But this is something that I think I would like to see more young men doing, and that's taking time, like legitimately allotting time to the training of their mind and the articulation of their beliefs surrounding gun ownership. So I did a video actually recently on YouTube, shameless plug. Go subscribe, please. Peter Ildefonsa, YouTube, Peter Ildefonsa. I did a video talking about advice to my 21-year-old self, specifically concealed carry advice to my 21-year-old self. And one of the main things that I hit on was the seriousness and severity of concealed carry. But what I see very prominently in young men, but also older men, and I'll primarily address young men here, is people presenting beliefs that they just simply believe. And I'm going to use a follower of mine that I honestly don't even remember his name. So if he listens to this, he might be mad and unfollow me, but that's the worst he can do. So I'll get over it. And I'm sorry to him in advance. He gave me an example of, I said something about coffee being healthy. I posted something about coffee being healthy, and he was like, nah, I'm of the opinion that coffee is neither healthy or unhealthy. And I was like, oh, I posted, this video where a guy breaks down a bunch of scientific studies that have been conducted on why coffee is healthy. What's like your counter? And he's like, I don't have one. I just don't think it is. And I was like, you see information being presented and your counter is, I don't agree with that, and you have no reason to do that. And I think a lot of people do that. And I think when it comes to gun ownership, and this is part of the gun community and also the responsibility on the gun community and the gun industry, is how we present gun ownership to other people. I think in order to do that, you have to have thought it out well. I think you need to know why you believe the things that you believe and why you practice the things that you practice. Not everything is going to have a significant belief behind it. And we sometimes get caught up in trying to put too much weight on things that don't matter. 14.5 pin and weld versus 16-inch. Guess what, guys? Like, don't attach your moral compass to that. That's not as important of an issue. And people get into like these moral arguments of which is better, red dot or an LPVO, or Glock versus Smith and Wesson, or whatever it is. It's like, so nowhere it doesn't matter, but take time to consider that and take time to develop your beliefs well in a manner that you can articulate them well, because that is a huge part of the cultural battle that we are fighting.
All righty. Well, I appreciate that advice. I think that it's something important. Those who've been listening to the Redacted Culture Cast probably agree with you, but I think
Yeah.
it hasn't been stated in a while, and it hasn't been stated so well. So thank you very much for that. I'm gonna probably steal it from you, and so
Go ahead.
we're gonna return to our familial roots of highway robbery.
There we go. Well, this is your show, so it's all yours.
No, hey, so Peter, thanks very much. I know you started plugging some of your stuff there. Where can people find you? Where are you most? Where's the best place for you to interact? I know we in this culture and this industry we deal with social media censorship.
Mhm.
It's nothing new. It's just going to continue to be there. We got to figure out ways around it. But where do people find you? How do they go?
Yep. So Peter Ildefonsa, Ildefonsa.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly how it sounds, but it's a little tricky. Ildefonsa. Peter Ildefonsa, and that is on X, Instagram, or X being Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and then also my website is peterildefonsa.com. The primary place that I spend the most time, probably just because of that's where I was the longest, is Instagram. And obviously, Instagram has DM. So if you wanted to hit me up, that's probably your best bet. But YouTube is my main focus these days, purely because it is a little bit less censored. And I do believe it has the variation of video links and stuff like that that lends itself to a better use. And yeah, I don't know, you can just do a lot more in the length of YouTube than you can on Instagram. So if you're wanting to support me, the best thing that you can do, honestly, is to just subscribe to YouTube, follow me on Instagram, all that good stuff.
Sounds good. All right. Well,
Yeah.
Peter, it's been a pleasure. We're gonna have you on again sometime. I've already got another question in the hopper for you, but
I can't wait.
we can't get deep into it now. We don't have time. That it being the case, for those who are still supporting the Redacted Culture Cast, we thank you. The two ways that you can be a part of our show and you can jump onto our program is you can go over to redactedculture.locals.com. That's going to be our equivalent to Patreon. It's sporadic in information, but you do get 10% off the shop, and the shop is at redactedllc.com. That's also where you'll find our events, things that we're putting on. This will be the announcement. Right now, we are putting together the details for a public land cleanup in Utah, and we are speaking with the appropriate parties. But we did one recently in Phoenix with Desert Warship and that's Desert Warship, WARSHIP, and that's basically my timer. And Method Endeavors. Method Endeavors is a training company out of Phoenix. Desert Warship is a culture group and a bunch of other cool guys. They brought out hot dogs, and we cleaned up a big area in outside of Phoenix where there's people go to shoot. So these are these small events that we're putting on, and it's really not about us. It's really about you guys who come out to the events, and we thank you for doing that because it's the least we can do. It's the easiest way to meet folks and get out of the house. So thank you very much for essentially being my version of a what do they call it, a emotional support pet. You're like, oh, emotional support public cleanups. I'm like, I need a stability. So thanks for coming out to those. That's what you find out more details on those at redactedllc.com, as well as you get access to our shop. And so for those things and all of that coming together, thank you very much for your time. And so in closing, go forth and conquer.